Well, hello everyone. Welcome to my week 7 video. And in this week's video, I'm going to talk with you about the paper 2 assignment sheet and the elements of poetry, which are both two very important documents that you need to understand thoroughly in order to do well on paper 2. So if you want to follow along with me, and that's always a good idea, go to content up at the top of our Brightspace course page. And once you've clicked on that, look in the left-hand sidebar for major paper assignments and related materials, and then click on Paper 2. And you'll see that Paper 2 is an explication of poetry. But when you hear that word, think explanation, right? Because that's what it means. It just explains and interprets a poem of your choosing that you're going to write about in order to demonstrate a clear understanding and interpretation of the poem's details, of its underlying meaning, so its theme, and of the techniques the poet has used to produce meaning and content, and any other unique or important aspects of that poem. So for this paper, you'll write that general explication, think explanation, of a poem we've studied together in Unit 2. That develops a central idea as expressed in your thesis statement. And that thesis should come at the very end of your very first introductory paragraph. That's where it needs to be placed. So if you're thinking, oh my gosh, where's Unit 2? I don't know what that means. Where is that? How do I know where that is? Well, Unit 2, you'll find it if you go to our syllabus, go again to Documents, and look for Course Syllabus in the left-hand sidebar. And you'll see where Unit 2 begins. It begins on the day that the final draft of Paper 1 came due, and it ends on the day that the final draft of this paper comes due. So it's the unit on poetry. And so speaking of dates, I've laid out the important ones for you. So the 24th of March will be our idea workshop for Paper 2. So you'll go to the Assignments tab up at the top of the page. You'll look for Idea Worksheet for Paper 2. You'll follow the instructions there and upload before 11:59 p.m. on Wednesday, March 24th. And just as with Paper 1, the Idea Worksheet is just a way to begin to think about how you want to structure this paper, what your main points might be, what your thesis might center on, etc. You're not locked into the choice that you make there. By the way, you can change your mind, but it's a way to begin. On Monday, the 29th of March, we'll have our pre-writing for Paper 2 coming due. Excuse me. And you'll find that in the Week 11 discussion board, pre-writing for Paper 2. So this time around, you won't be submitting a whole rough draft because the truth is that we professors simply do not have the time to comment thoroughly on rough drafts for every single paper. So I do it for Paper 1, for the first paper in the class, so that you get my feedback, you understand how I'm going to grade up front, and then after that, I will only comment on, in this case, your pre-written intro with your thesis and the little outline that you're going to submit. So you'll submit a pre-written introductory paragraph with your thesis at the end and an informal outline. It doesn't have to be fancy or long. That just lays out 3 main points for feedback into that discussion board before 11:59 p.m. on Monday night, the 29th of March. And remember that this will work just like the rough draft for Paper 1. If you do not submit it by the deadline, then 10 points are deducted from your Paper 2 grade. And then on Monday, the 5th of April, that's the day that the final draft of Paper 2 comes due, no later than 11:59 p.m. that Monday, the 5th. So after you've gotten feedback from me on your introductory paragraph, your thesis, and your outline, submit the final draft via the Assignments tab and look for Paper 2 Final Draft. And remember, with all the major papers, 10 points are deducted from your Paper 2 grade for every calendar day that paper is late. And that includes the day that it's due and weekends. And then papers aren't accepted after 5 days. So bear that in mind. The specifics, this paper should again be a minimum of at least 3 full pages in length. So if it's shorter than that, you're going to get points deducted. You can be longer than that. You can go to 4 pages. You don't want to go beyond that and ramble on and on. But at least 3 full pages. Obviously, you've got to type it, double space it in Times New Roman 12-point font with standard margins. And for this assignment, you only need to document, to cite your primary source, the poem that you're analyzing. However, I strongly encourage you to add a second source, and obviously if you do, you'll need to cite it as well, that either offers a literary critique of your poem or that comments on a technique maybe that's at work within this poem. I strongly urge you to do that because it will make your paper better. Obviously, you have to incorporate quotes and paraphrases. So, if you're putting the quote into your own words, that's a paraphrase, with citations both at the end of the quote or paraphrase within your paper and on a separate works cited page in MLA formatting. If you do not do those things, serious points will be deducted and you could fail the paper. So that's important. Our goal in paper 2 is to write, again, a careful explication or explanation of a poem of your choosing as long as it's one listed on the syllabus in Unit 2. And again, Unit 2 began Monday, the 1st of March, the day that paper 1 came due, and it ends on the day that the final draft of this paper comes due. So you want to notice every technique that the poet has used. So look back at this document that we're about to review in my video here, The Elements of Poetry, for help. If you're struggling and thinking, what can I write about? Well, The Elements of Poetry gives you a lot to write about. Also, pay careful attention to and address issues like symbolism. Are you seeing objects or ideas within the poem that are symbolic of something greater? Sound, rhythm, tone, setting, all of these things give you things to write about. And finally, be sure to address how your chosen poem reveals the author's main theme. That's the most important thing that we're always getting at in a literary analysis paper. So to create a successful paper, your essay should answer the following questions. Remember, not literally. You don't want to write your paper and answer to these questions, but these questions are things you should be thinking about and asking yourself in the writing process. So, have you chosen a poem listed in Unit 2 of our syllabus? If you haven't, you're probably going to get a 0 for the paper. Have I written a compelling thesis statement? So, for example, your thesis should say something more meaningful than the poem Those Winter Sundays by Robert Hayden is very beautiful. Well, it may be, but that's a very weak thesis. We need to know maybe what kind of theme is being revealed through the poem. We need something more substantive and thoughtful than that. And you need to avoid vague words like beautiful and good and bad, because your idea of what is beautiful and the reader's idea may be very different ideas. You want to tell us how and why it's beautiful. Have I checked my topic sentences? So the first sentence of each one of my paragraphs, to be sure that I'm making points of analysis, of explication, explaining the poem, rather than just summarizing what's happening in it. I'm not writing a plot summary, right? I'm writing an explication. So if I see that my topic sentences say things like, next the narrator discusses how cold it is in the house before his father lights the fire. And then I go to the next paragraph and it says, finally he asks what he knows about love. I might just be writing a summary of what happens rather than explaining what it means, how the theme is being revealed, the techniques that the writer is using, etc. Does my intro have a hook? So I want to begin my very first paragraph, my introductory paragraph, with a line that makes my reader want to read my paper. Have I included the following information in my introductory paragraph? The title of the work, the full name of the author, the reason this poem matters, the reason it has meaning, and my thesis statement at the end of paragraph 1. Have I remembered that poetry titles are placed in quotation marks almost always? The only exception would be if the poem is super long, like the length of a book or something, right? and that's unusual. So you're going to put that title in quotation marks every single time you use it, or you get points deducted. Have I remembered to refer to the author by last name only after I've introduced him or her fully in my intro? So let's say I'm writing about Marge Piercy's Barbie doll. In my introductory paragraph, I'll refer to her as Marge Piercy, her full name. But after that, I'm not going to call her Marge or Mrs. Piercy. I'm going to call her Piercy, because that is protocol for academic writing. And I'm not a high school writer anymore. I don't want to sound like that. I want to sound like a professional writer. Have I used literary present tense? So remember, we discussed this earlier. Since literature exists in perpetuity, it can be read again and again. We use present tense to refer to the characters and their actions. So here's an example. The speaker in Barbie doll uses sarcasm at the end of the poem when wishing a happy ending to every woman. Not used, but present tense, uses. Have I used formal academic language throughout my paper? I want to elevate my language. I don't want to make it sound like I'm texting my friends. I want to use formal language. Do I have correct in-text citations, also called parenthetical citations? So after a quote, after a paraphrase where I've put the quote into my own words, in parentheses, I have to have the line number from the poem, or I'm sorry, the author's last name, and then the line number or numbers from the poem. Do I have a separate works cited page in MLA formatting? If I have forgotten my in-text citations and my works cited page, I could fail this paper. Have I been careful not to plagiarize? I have to document. I have to cite my sources, all of them. Have I included quotes from my chosen work? If you don't include any quotes, you probably will not pass this assignment. And have I remembered to incorporate the quotes smoothly by introducing them with a phrase? So the golden rule is, if a quote appears as a sentence all by itself in your paper, it is dropped. You have dropped it. You have to incorporate it into some phrasing of your own, into a sentence of your own. And have I used diagonal marks to separate the lines in a poem when I'm quoting them, placing a space before and after each diagonal? And I give you an example here. What did I know, space, diagonal, space, of love's austere and lonely offices. So I've separated those lines with a space, the diagonal, and another space. And then I don't have to repeat the author's last name in my in-text citation because I've said it, Hayden, in my attribution, but I do have to give the line numbers, 13-14. Do I have a fully developed intro, body, and conclusion? Have I answered the question, so what, who cares? Why does this poem matter? How does it help us? How does it make us become better or wiser human beings? And have I included an analysis of things like the poet's language and tone? So is it sarcastic? Is it cold? Is it distant? Is it elevated language? Is it everyday language? The style, the rhythm, the rhyme. Does it rhyme? Is it true rhyme or slant rhyme? Or is it free verse without rhyme? And any other important techniques that Elements of Poetry document that we're going to talk about next will give you a lot of ideas there. So now I give you an example of a possible thesis and game plan for this paper. So here's the first example. In Marge Piercy's iconic poem, Barbie Doll, a cold, sterile speaker tells the story of a girl child who is bullied over her large nose and legs. By carefully explicating the connotations of the poet's language, along with the symbolism used, one may derive Piercy's theme. Societal pressures to achieve a perfect physical appearance can lead to tragedy. So for a thesis like that, I've got to carefully consider every word in that poem. What are its figurative, connotative meanings? Now that word connotation is going to haunt you on the midterm, on quizzes, on the exam on literary terms. It's going to come back and haunt you. You need to understand it. So think of it this way. The denotative meaning of a word is its literal dictionary meaning. If you were to look it up in the dictionary, here's what it means. But the connotative meaning of a word refers to all the associations we make in our minds when we hear that word. And we're going to talk about that more intricately when we get in just a moment to the elements of poetry. So think about the connotative meanings. How do the analogies compare to each other in the poem? How are they similar? How are they different? And you want to consider elements like the lack of rhyme. This is free verse, along with that sterile tone of that speaker who feels so distant to us. We don't even know how the poet or how the speaker feels until we get to the very end of the poem, when the poet makes that sarcastic remark about, to every woman a happy ending, right? How are things like tone and setting used to uncover the author's underlying theme? Now here's a second example of a poem that we're actually reading together again in Unit 2. Theodore Rothke's lyrical poem, and that term lyrical refers to a poem focused on emotion, right? It doesn't tell a story necessarily. It's more focused on the speaker's emotion. Theodore Rothke's lyrical poem, My Papa's Waltz, describes the dance the speaker engages in with his alcoholic father as he attempts to navigate his need for fatherly love from a man who is clearly abusive. A thoughtful explication of the poet's word choice, use of symbolism, and rhyming techniques will reveal Rothke's primary theme. The need for love outweighs every other human longing. Now, you may find other themes within that piece, and they may all be correct, as long as you can prove them with textual evidence. So the game plan for that type of paper would be to demonstrate again through line quotes, through paraphrases, how a little boy in the poem continues to long for his father's love despite the abuse that he's receiving, and that his mother is enduring. And again, you have to consider every word, its connotative meanings. Look carefully at the symbolism within the poem. Is it universal? Is it cultural? Is it contextual? Or is it all of the above? And we're going to talk about that again here in just a moment when we look at the elements of poetry. So how, for example, does the symbol of waltzing, of dancing, help to solidify the idea that the dance between the father and the son is actually a recounting of physical abuse? He's being knocked around here and there, right, as his alcoholic father is abusing him. How does the rhyme used in the poem mirror the timing of a dance? So think about that. All right, so that's the paper 2 assignment sheet. And now if you will go back with me into content and into course documents, and you will have to hit load more at the bottom of the page, you will find the elements of poetry. So let's take a moment to look at this. So poetry this is kind of a definition, it's characterized by the presence of imagination, emotion, universal truth, and sensory impressions, so sight, sound, touch, taste, smell. It's expressed rhythmically, right? And usually in an orderly arrangement of parts. It expresses within itself, though, a unity, a sense of unity, and it's written with the main purpose of providing aesthetic and emotional pleasure and or response. So you see here some well-known definitions of poetry by famous writers. Poe called it the rhythmical creation of beauty. I like that. And Wordsworth said that poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings recollected in tranquility. Good old Wordsworth. Arnold called it a criticism of life. And Carlyle, I love this one, called it musical thought. Hunt said poetry is the utterance of a passion for truth, beauty, and power. And Shelley said it's the record of the best and happiest moments of the best and happiest minds. And that's true. But it's also the record of the worst and most horrible moments of some of the most depressed minds ever. It's not all roses and lollipops, as you will see. So now we have some basic elements, and these are just a few of the elements and techniques that poets use, but all of this gives you material to write about in paper 2. So imagery. Every poem in the world is going to use the technique of imagery. And that's words that call upon our senses, okay? So to some extent, all words create images, but a good poem is going to set forth a very exact, original kind of image. An analogy is an extended comparison, right? So in Martin Espada's poem of the threads that connect the stars, for example, he makes an extended comparison between 3 generations of immigrant men who are becoming gradually Americanized, and he does that through the extended metaphor of stars. That's not one that we're reading in this class, but it's a good example. Personification. Think of my cat, Princess Fufu, who is now asleep in the living room, thank God, and who isn't interrupting this video, thank God, because sometimes she does. So I personify her. I give her human-like traits. She thinks she is a human. She thinks she is just the ruler of all, as a matter of fact, and she basically is. But that's the technique of giving an idea, an object, or an animal human-like traits. Animism, sort of related to personification, gives life to an object that is inanimate. And so I give you the example of the fog comes on little cat feet, which obviously it can't really do. Apostrophe. So when we hear that term, we generally think of punctuation, where we're using the apostrophe mark to show possession or ownership. But in poetry, it refers to the act of addressing someone who isn't really there, or something that is non-human. Rhyme, we know that's the repetition of similar or identical sounds in a poem, but there are 2 kinds of it, and this idea is definitely going to come back and haunt you on that exam on literary terms. So there's true rhyme, which is an exact rhyme like day and way, and then there's slant rhyme, which is close, but it's not an identical sound, like move and love. So when you're writing paper 2 about your poem, ask yourself, does it rhyme? If not, it's called free verse. And think about how the use of free verse might affect the poem as opposed to rhyme. Think about what the rhyme pattern is doing for the poem. So think about, does your poem contain true rhyme, slant rhyme, or a combination? So to clarify the difference between true and slant rhyme a little more intricately for you, move and groove is a true rhyme. They sound exactly alike. Love and dove and above are true rhymes, sound exactly alike. But move and love is a slant rhyme. They're close, but they're not identical. Another technique you may see in some poems is internal rhyme, and that refers to words within a line that are rhyming with each other. So the lines aren't just rhyming with the last words of each line, maybe, or the last words of every 4th line, or whatever the technique is in the poem, but words inside the same line that are rhyming. So that might be something that you're finding that's being used in the poem you're writing about. Another technique poets use is alliteration, so the repetition of the same sounds. See, I just did it with the S sound. The same sounds at the beginning of words. So an example would be Langston Hughes's famous Harlem Renaissance poem, A Dream Deferred. Hear the D sound repeated, dream deferred, that's alliteration. It just is a little sprinkling of a pleasant sort of aesthetic value within the poem. It's pleasing to the ear. And poems are really made to be read aloud, by the way. Now we come to assonance. So, similar internal vowel sounds like scream and beach and screech, that would be assonance. Consonants, the opposite of that, would be the use of similar internal consonant sounds like leaves and lives. So you might see either or both of those techniques in your poem. Cacophony, oh, that's a harsh, non-harmonious sound, often produced by the use of hard consonants in a poem. Now, when I think of cacophony, I think of my little church in East Ridge. So we had a piano player who did not like to play minor chords and often just flat out refused to play them. We had an organist who would play minor chords. We had a choir director who was not formally trained in music, Brother Woody. And when he directed the choir, he did this. So it was like he was washing an imaginary window. So if he wanted you to go faster, he'd do this. If he wanted you to slow down, he'd do this. And then we had Miss Eva on the front row of the choir, who was a soprano, who sang loudly and about that much off key, My father used to say she couldn't carry a tune in a lard bucket, quote unquote. So you put all of that together, and especially if you had a song like We Three Kings at Christmas time where you had all those minor chords, you want to talk about a cacophony. It was a cacophony, and a funny one too. Euphony is the opposite of that. So that's language in a poem that is harmonious sounding. And then another technique that's fun to think about is onomatopoeia. It's just fun to say that word. Say it, onomatopoeia. You know you want to say it. Onomatopoeia. Words that sound like what they mean. Hiss, bang, boom, pop. That's onomatopoeia. So those are just a few of many, many techniques and elements that poets use. But this gives you material to write about in paper 2. Now, meter and rhythm is also very important when we're talking poems. So we know what a syllable is, right? It's any word or part of a word produced in speech by one breath. Technically, that's the definition. But in poetry and in normal speech, we have inflection. We have syllables that are accented and syllables that are not stressed. So if we want to scan a poem, a process called scansion, then we would mark the accented and unaccented syllables, and we'd use what looks like a little diagonal above a syllable to mark the syllable that's going to be stressed. And we'd use what looks like a little lowercase u to mark the syllables that are not accented. So a foot in a poem refers to the basic rhythmic unit of verse, and normally it consists of one accented and one or two unaccented syllables. And the line of a poem will obviously consist of one or more feet. So scansion is the process of discovering the rhythm of a poem, right? The main rhythm of the poem. And there are different kinds of feet. There's iambic. And so today would be an example of an iambic foot. So see how there's two syllables, today, and the stress is on the second syllable. Trochaic is the opposite of iambic, daily. So we have two syllables, but the stress is on the first one. Anapestic, intervene, we have three syllables with the stress on the third. And then dactylic, which is the opposite of anapestic, yesterday, we have three syllables with a stress on the first syllable. So if we were scanning those words, the stressed syllable, we'd put a little, what looks like a little lowercase u above it. And the unstressed syllables, we would put what looks like a little diagonal mark above them. So that's the process of scansion. We would mark the accented and unaccented syllables in each line. We would identify, is this foot iambic, trochaic, anapestic, dactylic. We would count how many feet there are in each line and identify the line. Now, I will never ask you to scan a poem in any of my quizzes or exams ever. But I will ask you what scansion is. And so you do need to know what that means. And remember, scansion is not an exact science. So if you and I were scanning the same poem, we might do it just a little bit differently. We'd probably be really close, but it's just kind of one way of describing the poem's rhythm. And also, perfect regularity of rhythm in a poem does not mean that this is a good poem. So, I mean, sometimes some of the greatest poems in the world will have perfect rhythm, but sometimes some of the most awful poems in the world, like the ones my husband writes to me, will have perfect rhythm. I have to whisper because and they will suck. But it's the thought that counts. Okay. So, symbolism. We know that a symbol is an image that stands in or represents something else, right? Stands in for something else. It can suggest two or more simultaneous levels of meaning, but there are different kinds of symbols, and I alluded to this in our discussion of the paper 2 assignment sheet. So a symbol might be a kind of universal symbol where the associations are commonplace enough to be understood by people everywhere. And an example of that would be weather, like cloudy, dark, stormy skies. as being symbolic of trouble or sadness. A cultural symbol would be one where the associations are common to a particular culture or group, like, for example, the American flag in the United States. A contextual symbol would be one that derives its meaning, its associations derive meaning within the context of a particular work. So like the apple in Genesis or the snake in the Genesis story. Now, numbers in poetry contain symbolism. 0 is representative of eternity or infinity because it's like a never-ending number. 1 of unity or divinity. 2 of marriage or conflict, and so on and so forth. I'll let you read those for yourself. But if you see numbers being used in poems, they might represent something deeper. Colors are the same way in any kind of creative writing. And we talked a little bit about connotative meaning. So words will have positive connotations, positive associations, and negative associations. And you can really see this with the use of color. So white, the positive connotations would be innocence, purity, light. The negative connotations might be ghost or the KKK, something horrific like that. You think of the white hoods they wore. Yellow, positive connotations might be the sun, wisdom, light. A negative connotation might be cowardice, because you've heard that phrase. He's a yellow-bellied coward. The color red, a positive connotation might be passion or Valentine's Day. A negative connotation might be blood or war or temper. And if you've heard that we gingers have a temper, it's not true. It's a big old lie. So you can look through the other colors I've given you and see kind of the positive and negative associations there. Other common symbols you might see in creative writing and poetry especially would be water, representing purity, birth, baptism. The sea, spiritual mystery, rebirth, the unconscious. The sea might also represent an uncontrollable force that could consume us, right? The rising sun, birth, a beginning, enlightenment. The setting sun, death or an ending. And remember that times of day and the seasons of the year sort of correspond with the human life cycle in creative writing. So spring would represent the beginning of something, summer, maybe the prime of life, autumn, sort of decline, and winter, an ending or a death. And same thing with the times of day. So there also might be Freudian symbols that you would see in a poem with extended objects like a knife or a sword or a spear, sort of making you think of males, and concave objects like a cave or a room or a bowl being associated with females. So there's denotation, connotation again, and just remember, the connotative meaning is so important. All the associations, the emotional overtones that we think of when we think of a word, just right off the top of your head. So your very first task in explicating a poem and understanding it and writing about it is to consider every word in it. What are the connotative meanings of that word? What are the associations? A lot of words will have multiple and even conflicting connotative meanings. So also consider structure and form in poetry, and we're going to be talking more extensively about that in the weeks to come. But these two are ideas you can use as you're writing paper 2. So is the poem narrative? And that's a poem that concentrates on telling a story, on action. So an example would be a ballad or an epic poem. Is it dramatic? And that's a poem that focuses on dialogue or a scene or series of scenes. Is it lyric or lyrical, also called descriptive or expository? Well, that's one that's characterized by the emotions, the ideas, the feelings, the state of mind of the poet or the speaker in the poem. And that's more internal structure. We'll also get into external structure. So what the poem looks like on the page. Another thing that you want to understand that will come back and haunt you on that exam on literary terms would be what a sonnet is, how we define a sonnet. So it's 14 lines of iambic pentameter. That's the definition. And there are 2 kinds of sonnets. There's the Italian, also called the Petrarchan, and there's the English sonnet, also called the Shakespearean. So know that. And if you happen to write about a sonnet, choose a poem that's a sonnet from Unit 2, then, again, that gives you something to write about as well. So thanks for bearing with me. I know this was a long one, and I'll see you next time around.